Okay, now it's important that, say, everywhere in New South Wales has the same time. Okay, we want everybody in, say, Dubbo and Sydney for their clocks to say the same thing. Similarly, New South Wales and Victoria will always have the same time there. During the time of the year where we don't have daylight savings, Queensland will be at the same time. And basically, places that sort of run due north and south of each other will normally have the same time zone. But if you think about it, if you're on one side of the earth, so here's my very dodgy drawing of Australia, so there's Western Australia there. Anything due north of it, say when it's midday there, if you're on the other side of the earth, and the other side of the earth would be the 60-degree west meridian, so basically 60 and 120 add up to 180. Now here it is shown here, so this is actually the back of this same globe here. So the places that are exactly on the opposite side of the earth, when it's midday here, it's midnight there, okay? And basically what happens is that we divide the world up into these different strips, and each of these strips happens to be 15 degrees wide, and that's simply because the earth spins 364 degrees a day and there are 24 hours in a day. Divide that up, you'll get it spins at 15 degrees an hour. So we split the Earth up into all of these strips, each 15 degrees wide, and they're what are called time zones. And basically, each country will fit into the time zone closest to them. They'll wiggle it around a little bit, and daylight savings effectively jumps you ahead to the time zone ahead. But that's basically how time zones work. Okay, let's see what happens when it's midnight in London, so on this prime meridian, this Greenwich meridian. Basically, if you're in Rome, you're about an hour ahead. If you're in Cairo, you're about 2 hours ahead. If you're here in Brisbane, you're going to be 10 hours ahead. Similarly, if you come to the west, say Rio de Janeiro, they're going to be 3 hours behind, and Los Angeles is going to be 8 hours behind. So that's how we use the time zones. And basically you fit into the strip which most closely relates to where you are. So basically, all of Eastern Australia there during winter is 10 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. Western Australia there is 8 hours ahead, so that accounts for the 2-hour difference in time between the East Coast and the West Coast. Now look, the centre of Australia, it should be 9 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time, but it's one of the few places in the world where they don't follow any of these time zones. They move half an hour ahead, so their Central Australian time is based on being 9.5 hours ahead of Greenwich time there. One of the few places on Earth that doesn't follow these exact hour intervals. Now, when the southeast of Australia goes into daylight savings, effectively they all jump one time zone to the east there. But we'll cover that later. Importantly, Western Australia, Northern Territory, and Queensland don't follow daylight savings, so that's why in summertime the difference in time between the east coast and the west coast changes compared to winter. Okay, now, depending on the country and how it's organised, look, you can be divided into different time zones, basically depending on whether the country runs east-west like Australia does. There's my really poor drawing of Australia, don't forget Tassie. So basically, because it runs east-west, we're divided up into 3 different time zones there. Now, okay, which time zone though? Because, if you think about it, there's the 150 degree line of longitude, okay? Basically New South Wales is going to follow that, basically this time zone, which is plus 10 hours ahead of Greenwich there. So you can see that's a bit more accurate for Sydney than it is for, say, Broken Hill, which interestingly enough follows South Australian time. Whereas, say, if we go to New Zealand, sort of over here, that's an even worse drawing of New Zealand. Sorry, that doesn't make it much better. Okay, they're because the country sort of runs north-south, they're all in that same time zone there. And they're, during winter at least, they're 2 hours ahead of Sydney. So they're based on the 12 hours ahead of Greenwich. In other words, they're exactly on the opposite side of the Earth, at least time-wise. Okay, so to give you an idea, again we're showing midnight here in London, or basically is time zero. So you can see all of the east coast of Australia is going to be 10 hours ahead. All of Central Australia will be 9.5, and that's a bit of an oddity. If you have a look through the rest of the map, you'll see that there are no other halves. It's the only place in the world like that. Again, so you've got all of everything to the east of Greenwich is ahead. Everything else to the west is behind there. So simply, if you know the time in London, to work out the time in Sydney, you just add 10 hours. Okay. If you know the time in London, you want to work out the time in Buenos Aires, you'll subtract 3 hours. And you can see that depending on country borders, they sort of can wrap around each other in funny ways there. Okay, some other things to note there is this only refers to ordinary time. So in daylight savings time, so Sydney actually becomes 11 hours ahead of Greenwich. New Zealand actually moves to be 13 hours ahead of Greenwich. Okay, bit bizarre if you think about it. Okay, now the other thing that we need to take account is what day of the week are we? This is why we need this international date line here. Basically, what happens if you were to say it was 12 noon in London, well, that means that it's going to be 12 midnight in Auckland because you're 12 hours ahead. So that's 12 noon, I'll say, on a Wednesday. Okay, that means it's going to be 12 midnight, sort of at the end of that same day. 12 midnight actually belongs to Thursday, actually. But if you think about it, if we come back here to sort of the edge of Alaska, a bit past there, we're going to be subtracting 12 hours. So somewhere back over here, it's sort of not shown on the map, it's going to be 12 midnight as well. But this time it's still going to be Wednesday. And the problem is, you can see somebody coming here is 12 midnight on a Wednesday. Somebody coming here is 12 midnight on a Thursday. And somehow we need to have this artificial boundary where the day changes. And so what actually happens, if you were to be flying across the international date line, you might have left Sydney on a Thursday, you'll land on the other side on a Wednesday. Similarly, if you come back, you leave on a Wednesday, you're coming back and you're landing on a Thursday there. Okay, and basically that international date line is just needed to work out what day everyone's on, and basically you can see it jinks and moves about. It's basically directly opposite the prime meridian, but we need to move it around a little bit so it doesn't say here cut off the edge of Russia. So for instance, all of Russia's on the same day. Similarly, there's various other Pacific countries. This isn't a particularly accurate line. It actually wiggles around a lot more than that. Okay, so here's a little bit more detail about the international date line. So our first jink here is to get around the edge of Russia. Then we need to have another jink so that all of these Alaskan islands are still part of Alaska and still on the same day. As we come down here, it's not shown there. I think that's perhaps Tonga, etc. in there. But anyway, some of the Pacific islands there. So we've got Hawaii over there. I think that's Fiji there to give you an idea there. So, imagine doing a flight from New Zealand through to Los Angeles. You're actually crossing that international date line three times. So good luck trying to keep a track of what day you're up to. Okay, Habib is flying from New York, USA to Istanbul, Turkey to visit his grandfather. New York is 5 hours behind Universal Time Coordinated, while Turkey is 2 hours ahead of UTC. Okay, so look, it doesn't hurt to draw a diagram. Just put Greenwich in the middle there. So New York is 5 hours behind and Turkey is 2 hours ahead. Okay, Habib wants to call his grandfather on the phone before he leaves New York. At what time should he call so that it's 6 p.m. in Turkey? So we want it to be 6 p.m. here in Turkey. And you can see that to get from Turkey back to New York, you'd have to subtract 7 hours. You subtract these first two, then the other 5. So you're going to go 6 p.m. minus 7 hours, and that's going to be equal to 11 a.m. in New York. Habib boards the plane at 1:45 p.m. New York time, and the trip lasts 8.5 hours. What's the local time in Istanbul when he arrives? So what I'd say here is work out what the arrival time is in Turkish time. So, departure. So departure, so we've got 1:45 p.m. New York time. Now, you can see if it's 1:45 here, we've got to add 7 hours to work out the time in Turkey. So it's 8:45 p.m. in Turkish time. Basically the arrival time in Turkey is going to be that 8:45 plus the 8 hours and 30 minutes for the flight time. Again, if we were to add that up, we're going to get 17 hours and 15 minutes. Now, how do we interpret that? In this particular case, the zero mark effectively would have been midday. So we're 17 hours and 15 minutes after midday, taking away the 12. So that's going to be 5:15 a.m. in Turkey. Now, it's going to be the next day. It doesn't say that in the question, but it doesn't hurt to work that out. Okay, so again, I'll just go through that again quickly. We worked out, or we were told, that the time of departure in New York was 1:45 p.m. We knew Turkey is 7 hours ahead, so that departure time was actually 8:45 p.m. in Turkish time. We need to add the 8 hours and 30 minutes flight time to that. So the 8 hours and 30 minutes is going to take us past midnight into the next morning. So we interpret this, this 17 hours of 15 minutes. We just take away the 12 hours up to midday from that to leave us, the 12 hours from midday to midnight, take that 12 hours away from that to work out the time in Turkey. Okay, we're going to use the world time zone map, the one we used earlier, to find the standard time in Sydney when UTC is 8 p.m. on Wednesday. So UTC here, it's based on 0. And you can see that Sydney, we're based on the +10, so we're 10 hours ahead. So we just need to add 10 hours to that. So we can go 8 p.m. Wednesday plus 10 hours. And if you think about that, the first 4 hours would take us up to midday, and then we've got another 6 hours. So that'll be 6 a.m. on the next day, which is 6 a.m. on Thursday. In other words, if you were in London and it was 8 p.m. on a Wednesday and you talked to somebody in Sydney at the same time, you'd be waking them up at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. Okay, the next example, we need to work out the time difference between New York and San Francisco. Now, if we have a close look here, New York is based on the -5 time zone and San Francisco on the -8. The distance, or the difference between -5 and -8, is going to be 3. So there's a 3-hour difference. Okay, New York and Paris. So again, New York is based on -5. Paris is based on +1. The distance, or difference between -5 and +1, is 6. Okay, so we'll take a bit of a closer look at time in Australia. So we mentioned that Western Australia was 8 hours ahead of Greenwich time, or the prime meridian, so it's UTC +8. And that stays the same all year. There's no daylight savings in Western Australia. Northern Territory is always 9.5 hours ahead for the whole year. South Australia is 9.5 hours through winter, but during summer it moves ahead by an extra hour. Okay, so it's 10.5 hours ahead of UTC. Queensland is always 10 hours ahead, it doesn't have daylight savings. And New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania, during winter they're 10 hours ahead, and during daylight savings they're another hour ahead. Okay, for example 10, we'll assume it's winter, so there's no daylight savings time, it should have specified. So Pete's in Perth and it's 11:30 a.m. He wants to ring his mother in Sydney. What time is it in Sydney? So during winter there's a 2-hour time difference between Western Australia and New South Wales. Sydney is further to the east, so we need to add 2 hours to that. So it's 11:30 plus 2 hours. That's going to give us 1:30 p.m. So it's just after lunch, depending on what time she has her lunch. Nick has just finished work at 5 p.m. in Sydney. What time is it in Adelaide? So South Australia's half an hour behind Sydney. So you just need to subtract half an hour there. So we're going to go 5 o'clock minus 30 minutes. So that's going to give us 4:30 p.m. So in other words, if somebody is finishing work at 5 p.m. in Adelaide, they've still got half an hour to go in their day. Okay, Simone in Melbourne wants to chat online with her cousin Zach in Vancouver, Canada. Canadian Pacific Standard Time is 8 hours behind UTC, while Melbourne is 10 hours ahead. Daylight saving is operating in Canada. Okay, so daylight savings, so this is a standard time. Again, so basically, let's draw ourselves a little diagram. So here's 0. So Pacific Standard Time, normally that's at -8. But when we've got daylight savings time, we move it forward by an hour. So we're really going to be using -7. Melbourne is at +10. So if we have a look at the difference there, we've got a difference of 17 hours between there. So depending on which way we're going, we're either adding or subtracting 17 hours, and we've got to think about that. We've also got the timeline to consider. The dateline, international dateline. The best way to do that is to avoid the international dateline. The international dateline is effectively here and here. So basically, if we just make sure we go through Greenwich Meridian effectively to find the time, that's the best way to go. So Zach it needs to be 4 p.m. on Friday here. We need to work out what time Simone is going to have in Melbourne. So all we need to do is take 4 p.m. on Friday and add the 17 hours. So 4 p.m. Friday plus 17 hours. So that's going to be 21 p.m. Okay, subtract the 12, that's going to be 9 a.m. and it's going to be on the next day. Okay, so look, you can see how those diagrams can basically take a whole heap of confusing information and get to a very simple answer, but there's actually quite a deal of thinking in these questions, even though the end solution is quite simple. Okay, so to answer these questions, we need to use this table here. So you just need to have that handy out of the textbook or print this out. Okay, so it's 4 p.m. Saturday in Sydney. What's the time in India? So we need to look down through the list until we find India. Okay, so the hours from Australian Eastern Standard Time, so that's going to be -4.5 hours. So we just start with 4 p.m. Saturday, we subtract the 4.5 hours, and what we're going to get there is 11:30 a.m. still on the Saturday. Okay, now Russia West, this will test me out. So Russia West should be somewhere in here. I think that's, here it is. So it's going to be -7 hours. So we're going to start with 4 p.m. Saturday. We're going to minus the 7 hours. So that'll take us to 9 a.m. on Saturday. In Greece, okay, so Greece should be, so it's -8 hours compared to Australian Eastern Standard Time. So 4 p.m. Saturday, -8, well, it's just like taking another hour off that one. So 8 a.m. on Saturday. Now Tonga, if you have a look here, because Tonga is actually sort of on the other side of where the international dateline should be, it's actually 3 hours ahead of Sydney time. So we're going to add 3 hours there. So that's going to be 7 p.m. still on Saturday. Now the reason that Samoa and Tonga are still on this side of the dateline, in other words the dateline's been bent around them, is so that they're on the same day as things like Fiji, Nauru, New Zealand, who they have a lot more to deal with. Okay, we're going to work out the time difference between a couple of places. Now I've just cheated and found them all of the different places we need on this list. Okay, so the time difference between Malaysia and New Zealand. So Malaysia is at +8 compared to UTC. New Zealand is at +12. The difference between 8 and 12 is 4. So we can just do +12 take away positive 8 is equal to 4. Well, you could just write down 4, that's not a problem. Okay, so Brazil East and Chile. So Brazil East is on -3, Chile is on -4, so that's a difference of 1 hour. Iceland and the Philippines. So Iceland is on 0, so on UTC. The Philippines is on +8, so the difference between 0 and 8 is 8. And Algeria and Salt Lake City. So Algeria is on +1, mountain time is -7. The difference between -7 and +1 is 8 hours. Okay, so we've got the Australian Open Tennis. It's broadcasting Melbourne time at 8:30 p.m. What's the local time in Dallas, USA? And if we look for USA Central Time, it's 16 hours after Australian Eastern Standard Time. We'll ignore the fact that that would actually be daylight savings, but we'll just ignore that for the moment. Okay, so we're just going to take that time of 8:30 p.m. and we're going to subtract the 16 hours. Well, look, it's easier to change that into 24-hour time, isn't it? So it's going to be 4:30, in other words, 4:30 a.m. If we look at Japan, they're 1 hour behind, so we're just going to take 1 hour off that to get the 7:30 p.m. And Sweden is 9 hours behind, so we subtract 9 hours from that to get 11:30 a.m. Okay, it takes 8.5 hours for a plane to fly from Sydney to Hawaii. If Heath leaves Sydney at 1:30 p.m. on Friday, what's the local time when he arrives in Hawaii? So it's multiple choice. Now, importantly, compared to Australian Eastern Standard Time, Hawaii is 20 hours behind. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with the time in Sydney. Let's change it to 24-hour time. So it's 13:30 on Friday. We're going to subtract the 20 hours to work out what time it was in Hawaii when we departed. And then we're going to add the 8.5 hours to account for the 8.5 hours flight time. Now look, the easiest way here, let's simplify that a little bit. So it's the same as starting at 13:30 on Friday. Combining that together, it's the same as minusing 11.5 hours or minusing 11 hours and 30 minutes. So if you start at 13:30 on Friday, subtract 11 hours and 30, you're going to get to 2 a.m. on Friday. So you notice that they've left just after lunch on Friday and they've arrived in the very early hours of Friday. Okay, so they've gained an extra day by flying to the east, and as you can see, that's going to be our answer C there. Okay, the time is 6 p.m. In Sydney, and we need to work out the time so starting with Melbourne. Now just bring this into shot. So basically what's going to happen here is that, so Sydney's on here, so basically we haven't been told that it's summer, so we'll assume it's ordinary time. So everywhere on the east coast will have the same time. Anywhere in central time will be half an hour less, and anything in Western Australia will be 2 hours less. Okay, so Melbourne will be on the same time, so it'll be 6 p.m. Hobart is on the same time. Let's see, there's nowhere else on the Surfers Paradise, that's also in Queensland, so they're all on the same time. Anywhere in Central Australia will be half an hour later. In other words, we subtract half an hour. And anywhere in Western Australia will be 2 hours earlier, so 4 p.m. there. Okay, so as we've mentioned before, Queensland, Northern Territory and Western Australia, they don't have daylight savings. So what's the difference there is going to be the following. So basically these three states and territories, they don't have daylight savings. These other ones do. So basically what that means is that Queensland is 1 hour behind. South Australia is still a half hour behind. Anything in Victoria or Tasmania is still the same time. Northern Territory is now 1.5 hours behind instead of the half hour it is normally. And Western Australia is now 3 hours behind. Okay, so remember, same time there, half an hour less, an hour less, an hour and a half less, or 3 hours less. Okay, so let's so the time in Melbourne, it's the same time zone, so it's still 10:30 a.m. Hobart, again, still the same time zone, not a problem. Alice Springs, so that's the Northern Territory. It's an hour and a half behind us, so we subtract an hour and a half to get 9 a.m. Perth in Western Australia is 3 hours behind, so that's going to be 7:30 a.m. Adelaide is half an hour behind, so it'll be 10 a.m. Surfers Paradise in Queensland, so it's an hour behind during summer, so it's 9:30 a.m. Okay, Robert in Tasmania wants to call his brother in Scotland, UK, when the time there is 4:30 p.m. daylight savings time. In other words, their daylight savings time. What time should Robert call? Okay, so let's draw ourselves a little bit of a diagram. So we know that Tasmania is 10 hours ahead. Now, Scotland during the normal time would be at the Greenwich meridian on 0, but in daylight savings time they go an hour ahead. So there's now only a 9-hour time difference there. So if we want the time here to be 4:30 p.m, the time in Tasmania, we just need to add 9 hours to that. So 4:30 plus 9 hours, so that's going to give us 13:30. Again, remember we were starting in PM there, so we've gone through to the next morning, so we need to subtract 12. So that's going to be 1:30 a.m, and that's going to be answer A.